All right, everybody. I wanted to do just a quick lecture. Hopefully, I'm not going to spend too much time. Although this is an interesting subject to me, so I could end up getting carried away like I normally do. But this is a really interesting subject that I really enjoy. And it has to do with something we call the social construction of childhood. And one of the things that makes this really interesting is because in our modern society, in our postmodern society, let's say. When we look at children as being just like biologically distinct, right? They're little, they have little itty bitty hands, right? And then they grow, and as they grow, they start to become more adult-like, right? And so we tend to make the assumption, the common sense notion, that there must be something that is just biologically distinct about children that just isn't true for adults. And I think there's some good arguments. I'm not going to counter that argument. But one of the things that we do have to understand is that our understanding of what it means to be a child is not a given. It is not premised on just the biological differences of children being little or less developed, right? So it has to do with how society defines what childhood is. That determines how we interact with children. So, and we can see that there's a whole variation. There's various ways of that societies, different cultures, deal with and interact with children. And this gives us evidence that childhood is not simply just a biologically distinct period of time, that in fact childhood is socially constructed. In other words, and you could review social construction theory a little bit, but what this means is that our understanding of the reality of childhood is based on the norms and values that are prescribed by our societies. That defines how we interact with children, and that reinforces the construction and how we understand childhood, right? So let's take a look at this idea. Let's prove that this is correct. Let's prove that childhood is not just biological, but it is in fact a social construct. All right. So the first one that we want to talk about, the first thing that we want to address is this fella right here. This is the guy who wrote this book. His name is Philippe Ariès. He is a French historian. Specifically, he was a medievalist, so he studied the medieval period, the Knights of the Round Table and all that other kind of stuff. So, and this is a really, really interesting, fascinating book if you can get your hands on it. And the claim that he is going to make in this book is that up until about 300 years ago, the very concept of childhood really didn't exist. That for medieval Europeans, the idea of a child being in a special, distinct period of time simply just did not exist. As the child grew up and was able to take on adult responsibilities, they were expected to take on those responsibilities. For the most part, according to Ariès, for the medieval Europeans, by the time a child was 7, they were pretty much incorporated into the adult world with adult responsibilities, right? And to a certain extent, adult privileges in many regards. Now, maybe that was a little bit different with regard to women and their young women and female children, being able to have their own children in a period, a menarche, right? But for the most part, Philippe Ariès is saying that there was no real concept of childhood. And some of the evidence that he uses, that he points to, is actually taken from medieval art. And one of the things that he noticed about medieval art is that children in medieval art were usually just dressed up just exactly the same way as adults were, right? Now, all right, but that's a bit of a problem, Philippe. All right, because maybe the children were just dressed up during the portrait, and then once the portrait was done, they went into their children's clothes and they went off and played. But Philippe Ariès is going to make some other claims, that to suggest that this was not that childhood was not a thing at that time, right? It was not a concept. Now, he does suggest that what ultimately is going to happen is industrialization and the Industrial Revolution. Again, we see, right, that 3-column chart. Right? I could probably put up a 3-column chart. Maybe I'll do a 3-column summary for the social construction of childhood. Maybe I'll have you do it. That might be a better idea. But anyway, either way, so we see this. We have pre-industrial medieval society. We see that that there's no concept of childhood. Then, as we move into industrialization, we start to see the development of a child. In other words, child endeavors are going to take place more and more in schools. Sorry about that. I had to answer that call. Anyway, so where were we? So we're seeing this transition between industrialization, pre-industrialization, and industrialization. Industrialization children are more and more likely to be going into schools. So they are. So instead of children, say, being in the fields or even being in the factories, children are spending more and more time with their peers rather than with adults. And what they're doing is they're developing youth cultures, they're developing youth norms and youth-based value systems that are going to now be incorporated into the larger society. Now, don't forget, this is kind of a functionalist perspective, right? And talking about how it's functionalist phenomenology, right? But also we can pull in Marx, we can pull in a little bit of Weber and say, whoa, wait a minute. Those standards may be a little bit different when you think in terms of social class, right? Whereas in industrial societies, you have middle classes who are able to invest in their children's educations, whereas in whereas working class, you still have a lot of farmers in industrial societies. Those young people are still in the fields, and when you're in the cities, there was an economic incentive to send kids into the factory. So I'll show some pictures on this video if you like of children working in the factories, right? So these were, it was not unusual to have children doing these what we would perceive as being adult jobs. So there is a class element or a class critique we can have of the Arrier's position and this idea of social construction of childhood. Now, there are some cross-cultural evidence that Arrier's is largely correct, even if he may not be correct on the particulars, right? One of my favorites, the textbook actually goes into Malinowski, and Malinowski did a really interesting study on tribal societies in the Pacific. And his book was called The Argonauts of the Western Pacific. He looked at the Trobriand Islanders in the Western Pacific. Fiji, that kind of area there. And some of the things that he noticed in his studies, he was more of an anthropologist. Some of the things that he noticed is that a lot of the pre-tribal, the tribal societies that he studied, they had very different sets of expectations for childhood. So, for instance, he noticed that these tribal societies tended to allow kids to have a lot more freedom. Right? Children were a lot more free. They had a lot more responsibilities, right? But they also tended to have more rights. The relationship in these tribal societies between children and adults was oftentimes a lot emotionally closer than they were in European societies. Malinowski, I think, was writing in like the 1920s. So this is kind of an old study. So the relationships tended to be a lot closer. They tended to be a lot more emotional. They tended to be a lot more supportive. Of children. And also another thing that Malinowski pointed out is that in these tribal societies, sexuality was something that was not necessarily restricted to adults. That sexual play and being exposed to sexuality itself was not something that was an expectation, right? In European societies, Western societies, we have strict prohibitions about even to this day, of exposing children to sexuality and sexual images. We'd much rather children see acts of violence than we want them to see acts of, lovemaking, right? Which is kind of weird when you stop and think about it. But still, we have a lot of prohibitions about sexuality, child sexuality, whereas those restrictions didn't necessarily exist for the Trobriand and the Pacific Islanders. So these are some of the. This is one little piece of evidence. Obviously, there's some differences going on here. Another piece of evidence that I find really interesting had to do with my own, historical research into this and studying Native Americans, specifically the Native Americans of the Northwest of the American. Not the American Northwest, the American Northeast. All right, so we're talking about. I was always very interested in the Iroquois Confederacy and the Algonquin, the Pequots, and that particular group in the Northeast, right? and they were very interesting. And their interactions with the Puritans, and this is just, I wasn't studying children specifically, but this is something that I found, right? So it was very interesting. And a lot of this is, a lot of the Puritan ethic with regard to childhood is stuff that we've kind of assimilated ourselves, right? So the idea, like, spoil the rod, spoil the child, right? In other words, children need strict discipline in order to get them to grow up the right way and to be good people. You need to make sure that they are strictly disciplined, and sparing the rod. Well, the rod is what you use to hit your child with in order to get them to conform and to get them to obey and be obedient. In the Puritan terms, of course, the idea was that children were especially susceptible to being tempted by the devil. Of course, they have not grown up, they have not developed that sense of discipline by which they can resist the demons and the devils and the old deluder, Satan, right? So the idea was that, sometimes if the child was becoming a little bit too willful, sometimes it was necessary to literally, this was a literal action here, you got to understand, beat the devil out of the child, right? Again, we use that term as metaphor, but for Puritans, that was not metaphor. That was the rationale for using corporal punishment, right? So you can imagine that if you were a child living in Puritan New England, right, in the Massachusetts Bay Colony, in these Puritan colonies, you were probably living with some really, really strict rules that were violently enforced by your parents, right? So what was interesting is learning about children. What would happen is once the Native American tribes in that area, so oftentimes they ended up in conflict with the Europeans, in conflict with the Puritans, and sometimes that would, mean going to war and conducting raids against European colonies. And sometimes during these raids, it was very common. It was part of the Native American culture at that time to capture the women or capture the children, especially the children of the group that you were at war with, and basically, they had a belief in slavery, so those children then became slaves of the tribe. But this wasn't the kind of slavery that we saw developing in, like, the antebellum South, that kind of really harsh chattel slavery. These children became, were kind of slaves, but they were also incorporated into the tribe. But they had that slave status. But for Native Americans in the Northeast, and I want to specify that this is specific to that particular group of Native Americans. Native Americans, there were hundreds of different Native American tribes, hundreds of different Native American cultures, and they all had different ideas with regard to childhood. So, for instance, the Comanche had much more strict and much more, assertive ways of raising their children than, say, the Algonquin or the Pequots and that kind of thing. But in the Northeast, the Native Americans tended to see childhood as a privileged time, a time of exploration, a time of play, a time of freedom, and they tended to be very much like your Trobriand Islanders. They tended to give the children a lot of time to play and a lot of support to go out and learn through play. So you got these children who were from Puritan families, right? Spare the rod, spoil the child, beat the devil out of the child. They were living with that, and then they were taken by these savages, right? And then they were brought into the tribes, and then they spent their time playing with their peers and running through the woods and doing stuff like that. So what would end up happening is the Europeans, the English, would then go and raid the Pequot tribes, and when they found white children, they would take these white children and they would bring them back to the parents, and the children would go absolutely just crazy, right? They would start screaming, they'd start trying to run away, start fighting with the English who were trying to take them away from the tribes and bring them back to the people. So the Puritans, of course, assumed that the Native Americans were using some kind of witchcraft against the children to brainwash the children into not wanting to go home with their parents. It wasn't that. It was the children were like, this was a place where they could play and romp around, and they were about to go home to where they were going to get beaten and rotted and that kind of thing. But this was a real good example of the cross-cultural differences between perceptions of childhood and the very real consequences of those conceptions of childhood. Now, there's another guy that you want to be familiar with. You want to be familiar with his theories. You definitely want to be familiar with Arias. You want to be familiar with Malinowski. You need to be familiar with Postman. Now, Neil Postman is really actually a pretty popular intellectual now. He was writing in like the 1980s, 1990s, and he wrote an interesting book called The Disappearance of Childhood. And in that book, what the claim that Postman is making is that, okay, we had pre-industrial societies where there was no real childhood. We have industrial societies where childhood starts to emerge, right? And then what he's saying is in the last 50 years, in other words, during this postmodern period, what we're starting to see happening is what he refers to as the disappearance of childhood. Childhood as a special time is starting to disappear, according to Postman. Well, why? What's happening? What is causing childhood to disappear? And Postman is saying that actually what the problem is media. All right? Media technology. First television and then the internet. And what these things have done, what television and the internet have done, is the television and the internet have opened up the adult world to children. So previous to television and previous to the internet, it was relatively easy for parents to isolate their children from the adult world, the world of adult problems, which also included things like violence, which included things like sex and sexuality, as well as adult responsibilities and paying bills and stuff like that, adult political concerns and that kind of stuff. But what has happened is television, movies, popular media, and now the internet have made it so that children no longer have, a kind of a slow access to the adult world, right? Before these, children would, kind of be slowly introduced to these elements of the adult world, especially sexuality. But now with the internet, with television, bam, you can Google it, it's in front of you, boom, welcome to the adult world, right? And this is something that's of huge concern to adults, right? You know this because when you go on your Chromebook and you try to find something, half the stuff that you're trying to find is blocked in some way, right? That's an attempt on the part of adults to try to hold on to that idea of adulthood, maybe, right? So, this is the idea that Postman is saying. Now, Postman is saying that now all of a sudden, all of the the violence and the sexuality and the concerns of the adult world are now becoming part of the childhood mystique. There's another one, Robertson, I believe it was. She is interesting because she makes the claim that actually another thing that's happening with childhood is that that's causing a disappearance of childhood is the disappearance of unstructured playtime, right? The idea now that parents are now, instead of just sending the kids out to play, parents are no longer doing that, and what they're doing is they're structuring playtime. You're being, I'll give you an example. So when I was a kid, my friends and I, we would go out and we would play baseball, for instance. We'll give that an example, right? There were no adults around. Adults weren't organizing the baseball. I wasn't on a baseball team, right? My friends and I, we went out and we played baseball. Well, it was very rare that there was enough of us to actually play like a full game of baseball where we could get 18 of our friends together to have a full baseball game. That just really didn't happen. I don't think it ever happened, right? So what would we do? We would have to figure out ways to innovate the game to make it possible for fewer numbers of people to play. We did this by, making the field smaller or narrowing narrowing the goal, the fair field. We did this by having like designated pitchers and stuff like that. There were all kinds of innovations, but that meant that we were there figuring out ways to innovate the game and innovate the rules of the game so that it fit our reality. And then, invariably, right, we would have conflicts. I thought I was safe. My friend thought I was out. We're going to yell and scream at each other. But ultimately, one of us is we're going to have to figure out a way to compromise this. And I realize what's going to happen is, if I always insist that I am right, right? Then the next time my friends want to play baseball, they're not going to want to play baseball with me because I always have to be right. So now what I have to do is I have to negotiate. Okay, well, I'll back down this time and I'll let you have it. All right, I'm out. You're right. And even if I'm convinced I'm not out, I'll let you have it because the next time we get into an argument, maybe I'll get my way, right? And we have to negotiate. So these are learning experiences that we had as kids without any adults around, right? And we had a blast. We always went out and we played. Later on, when we moved to Florida, one of the things that my parents did was they put me on a baseball team, right? And I got to tell you, it wasn't as fun being on a baseball team when there's all these adults around us all the time organizing things. Of course, I get it. I wasn't on a particularly good team. I got on the team, and the first thing that the coach said was, "We're going to be a bunting team." Bunting team? Okay, so we're going to lose a lot. All right, that's fine. Okay, now we know. As kids, there's no way we would have said, "Hey, let's be a bunting team." That was an adult idea, right? But anyway, that's the point. The point is that nowadays what's happening is that that unstructured playtime is starting to disappear, and parents are becoming more and more involved in their child's lives, which in and of itself is not necessarily a bad thing, but it doesn't give the child the time to go through those tensions, to resolve and innovate in the ways that children used to be able to when they were just expected to go out and play, right? Also, too, I mean, I look at you guys sometimes, and I see the kind of stress that many of you are under that just didn't exist when I was a kid. I went to school, and yes, there was a stress. I had to do my school classwork and stuff like that. But there weren't these mandated tests. There wasn't this, you got to get your ACE diploma, or you're going to, be hundreds of thousands of dollars in debt for college and all. There really wasn't those kinds of pressures weren't there. High-stakes standardized testing didn't exist. We took standardized tests here and there. We took the California Achievement Test. They extended homeroom. We took it, and cool, we were done. We never really thought anything about it, right? It wasn't a big deal, but now it's a big deal. And so what am I seeing from you guys? I'm seeing anxiety disorders, depression, all kinds of neurological things. You guys are popping, all kinds of mood-regulating drugs and stuff like that. How much of that has to do with some of the expectations and some of the more adult pressures that we're putting you under today? Maybe Postman and some of these other theorists have a point. Now, there is a postmodernist critique to this, suggesting that what is happening, though, in postmodern society is that, well, one of the things that's happening is young people are more and more getting the expectations of consumers, right? But what that's doing is, according to a postmodernist perspective, I would say Postman has a postmodernist perspective, but he doesn't necessarily think this is a good thing. But many postmodernists are saying, actually, what is happening, though, is that maybe what we're doing is we're increasing the freedom of children to make decisions as consumers in a consumer-based economy, in a consumer-based society. That children are learning at an early age the pressures of adulthood, and they're learning competitiveness, and they're learning, hierarchy. And this is in and of itself this allows them the freedom to be able to move up in that hierarchy. I don't know. But anyway, that is a critique that you would see. But anyway, as you can see now, we can see that I think there is plenty of evidence out there to suggest that childhood is a social construct. That's not to say that there are no biological imperatives with regard to childhood, right? Clearly there is. But how society deals with and works with the children has to do with how we define childhood. How do we define when childhood begins? How do we define what the stages of childhood is? And how does childhood end? Right? How does childhood end? One of the things that anthropologists point out is in postmodern societies, late industrial postmodern societies, we've developed a concept called the teenager. That wasn't always a thing, right? In an early 19th century, you didn't hear about teenagers being some special developmental stage, right? That's a relatively recent invention. And it was probably consolidated in like the 1940s, 1950s as we start to develop a a youth consumer culture, right? And we started to market movies and market television programs and market music to teenage audiences. So this idea of being a teenager now has kind of shaken things up, because previous to this, many cultures have, instead of having like a period, a teenage period, in which one is neither considered a child and one is neither considered an adult. Many of you, of course, are in that little interstice period, and it's, let's face it, it's awkward, right? You're not a child, you're not an adult. You don't have the privileges of childhood, but you don't have the rights of the adult. You're stuck, and it sucks, right? But in other cultures, instead of having this prolonged period, undefined period of teenage years, instead what cultures would do is they would create what were called rites of passage. So at a certain time, it was recognized that you, as a child, would undergo a particular rite of passage. An example of this would be the bat mitzvah. The bat mitzvah in Hebrew tradition. You would undergo this rite of passage, and then you would, and after you perform this ritual, you emerged an adult. Boom, you're an adult, right? There it is. And what has happened in postmodern societies is that teenage years, largely in the interest of consumer economics, right, has replaced the idea of this rite of passage. So then when should this rite of passage take place? Well, some cultures, I think bar mitzvahs is like, 12, 13. There's quinceañeras at 15, 16. One of the things that we have today is at 18, you're no longer a child. There's no rite of passage, there's no rhyme, no reason, just 18, boom, adult, welcome. Why? How did we decide upon that? By the way, there's no real biological reason for this, right? One of the things that we know that you probably learn in psychology is that your prefrontal cortex isn't fully developed until your early 20s. But it's different for everybody. Some people, their prefrontal cortex is fully wired and ready to go, and sometimes you got to wait a little bit longer. So when you actually try to look at that line between childhood, teenage years, and adulthood, it's not as clear as 18, ready to go, or bar mitzvah, ready to go. No, it's a little murkier than that. So anyway, this is the social construction of childhood. Hope you learned something. Hope it kind of got you thinking about some stuff. If you have any questions, let me know, and I will be happy to answer them.